Welcome, dear listener, to a book with a title that reads almost like a challenge, thrown gently but firmly across the years, straight at whoever happens to be listening right now. But will you? The author is Orison Swett Marden, a name you may already know if you've spent any time with the great American self-help tradition of the early 20th century. Marden himself rose from a childhood of real hardship, orphaned young, worked nearly to exhaustion as a boy on other people's farms, and yet he clawed his way to an education, built and lost fortunes, and eventually devoted the rest of his life to writing books meant to convince ordinary, struggling people that they were carrying around far more power than they had ever dared to use. This particular book, published in the early 1920s, in the years just after the First World War, feels shaped by that moment in history. Marden had just watched the world witness both the worst of human destruction and the most astonishing feats of human courage and endurance, and it left him more convinced than ever one central idea, which runs through every single chapter of this book, that the difference between a wasted life and a magnificent one is almost never a difference of raw ability. It is a difference of belief, of mental attitude, of whether a person dares to claim the larger self that has been quietly waiting inside them the whole time. So let's begin together by looking into what Marden calls the magic mirror. There's an old legend Marden shares with us here of a mirror that pilgrims once traveled great distances to look into, because it was said to reflect back not the person as they or their friends or their enemies believed them to be, but the person as they truly were. One particular pilgrim, a modest, self-doubting man who never imagined he could do anything worth noticing, looked into this mirror and was astonished. There, layered within his own familiar, homely reflection, stood another figure entirely strong, radiant, self-possessed, without a trace of the weakness or inferiority he had always assumed was simply part of who he was. He slowly realized his own higher and truer self, the very man his creator had actually intended him to become. That vision never left him. He spent the rest of his life quietly measuring himself against it, correcting his faults, strengthening what was weak, and within a few short years, Marden tells us, he had genuinely become that grander man the mirror had first shown him. Marden's whole point in opening the book this way is simple and direct. This new philosophy of life he's about to walk us through is, in his words, even better than that legendary mirror, because it never reflects back your failures, your fears, your disappointments. It shows you only what you are capable of becoming. And the most difficult thing in the world, Marden insists, is simply getting people to believe in their own bigness, to take real stock in their own hidden and unused ability. He shares two rather sobering letters here from a Harvard graduate and a Princeton graduate, both fully educated, both perfectly capable, and yet both stuck earning barely a few dollars a day, held back entirely by their own lack of self-confidence. Their education did them no good at all, Marden says, because of how low an opinion they carried of themselves. From this magic mirror, Marden moves us into what he simply calls a new philosophy of life, by which he means a whole blossoming movement of his era, blending psychology and spirituality, that insisted human beings were not fallen, sinful, helpless creatures, but were instead, in some very real sense, divine. He tells a lovely old parable here of a prince, raised in secret by a humble forester and his wife, entirely ignorant of his own royal birth, until one day a messenger finally arrives to bring him home to the palace. Most of us, Marden says, are living exactly like that hidden prince. We go about our entire lives never realizing our true origin, never suspecting the royal inheritance quietly waiting for us, because nobody has ever come to tell us the truth of who we really are. Marden is quite pointed here about what he saw as the failures of older religious teaching, which had spent centuries convincing people they were poor, miserable, sinful worms of the dust, forever separated from their Creator by some ancient and unforgivable fall from grace. The new philosophy, he insists, reverses this completely. It finds the God in every single person rather than the fallen creature. And this shift, small as it might sound, changes absolutely everything about how a person is able to face their own life. He explains here, quite carefully, the mechanics of what he calls this new way of thinking. Most people, he says, are hypnotized by fear, constantly picturing in vivid detail the very poverty, failure, and sickness they claim to dread. And in doing so, they unknowingly attract exactly what they fear, because whatever we visualize most intensely tends to etch itself into our lives. The remedy, Marden insists, is simply to reverse the picture. If you want health, hold the health ideal. If you want prosperity, you must think and speak prosperity, rather than constantly rehearsing all the reasons you'll probably never have it. Marden closes this chapter with a wonderful reminder that love is the only real antidote to hatred, exactly as water is the only real antidote to fire. You cannot extinguish anger with more anger, he says, any more than you could put out a blaze by pouring kerosene onto it. Christ's old command to love our enemies, he insists, was never sentimental foolishness. It was, in fact, precise and practical science. Now, let's turn to the third chapter, where Marden takes up the question of how, exactly, we go about connecting with what he calls the power that creates. He opens with a striking little parable about a tiger cub and a puppy raised together in the very same cage. The puppy, being larger at first, naturally dominates the play between them, and even after the tiger grows into a full-sized, immensely powerful jungle beast, he never quite loses that old habit of submission to his small childhood companion. Most of us, Marden says, are exactly like that grown tiger, still cowering before things that hold absolutely no real power over us except whatever power our own imagination has quietly handed them. There is, Marden insists, a divine force within every one of us, back of the flesh, but not entirely of it, that has come to the aid of every great inventor, every great discoverer, every genius who ever accomplished something remarkable. Thomas Edison himself, Marden tells us, believed he was merely a channel, simply passing along inventions from some greater cosmic intelligence that fills the entire universe, rather than personally originating them all on his own. Many an author, in the middle of a genuine burst of inspiration, has written as quickly as their hand could move, simply copying down a vivid, rapid parade of images passing through their mind that they themselves did not consciously create. Marden explains here what he calls the psychological law behind this connection. Whatever we sincerely and vigorously impress upon our subconscious mind, registering our vow, as he puts it, with real intensity and real conviction, tends to be carried out by the deeper, creative forces already within us. He offers a wonderfully simple, homely illustration of this law, describing how a person who firmly resolves the night before to wake at some unusual early hour to catch a train will very often wake at precisely that hour, without any alarm clock at all, simply because they impress a demand strongly enough upon their own subconscious mind. That very same law, Marden insists, governs health, governs prosperity, governs every ambition we might hold, if only we learn to make our inward demands with real, vigorous, unwavering conviction from this inward connecting force. Marden turns next to what he calls the new idea of God, Writing not long after the close of the First World War, Marden reflects here on soldiers who faced death daily in the trenches and who came, through sheer nearness to danger, to a startlingly clear and comforting realization that they themselves, their true and essential selves, were simply inseparable from the very life force of the universe, and so could never truly be destroyed. The old, distant, judgmental God of their grandparents' generation, Marden says, has quietly given way to something far closer and far warmer, a God present in every single atom, in every single living cell, rather than watching coldly from somewhere impossibly far away. One day, Marden recalls, Emerson himself was overheard simply murmuring to himself out in nature, God, God, all is God. That, Marden says, is very much the spirit of this new and closer idea of the divine. Now, having laid this whole spiritual foundation, Marden arrives at the chapter that actually gives his book its title, the chapter he simply calls, You Can, But Will You? He opens with a truly remarkable story of William Upshaw, a young man whose back was nearly broken in a farming accident at the age of 18, confining him to a bed of excruciating pain for 7 straight years. Yet from that very bed, Upshaw began writing for local newspapers and eventually devised an ingenious swinging seat that let him lecture from a wheelchair and went on quite astonishingly to raise over $100,000 for a women's college and eventually to win on crutches a seat in the United States Congress, defeating 6 able-bodied and experienced rivals along the way. Marden sets this story deliberately against a letter he received from a healthy, able-bodied young man complaining bitterly that opportunity simply no longer exists, that business has become too systematized, that there is, in this young man's own gloomy words, no chance left for anyone to rise. Marden's verdict on this mental attitude is blunt and direct. Instead of saying I can and I will, this young man was, in effect, saying I can't and I won't. And of course, Marden says he doesn't, because without the genuine will to succeed, even the greatest natural genius amounts to nothing at all. He quotes Marshal Foch here, the great French commander of the war, who insisted that the most brilliant qualities of intelligence are absolutely nothing at all without what Foch simply calls the will to victory. Marden drives the same point home with the story of Frank Woolworth, who began his entire career as an unpaid grocery clerk earning $3.50 a week, and yet, through nothing but sheer persistence, eventually built a great chain of stores and that beautiful Woolworth building that so many admired as one of the finest structures in all of New York City. The chapter's real challenge, though, lands squarely on the shoulders of the listener. Marden insists that whatever any successful person before you has ever accomplished, you very likely possess the same raw hidden material within yourself right now. The real and only question, he says, is never whether you can. It is simply and always whether you will. Now let's turn to a chapter Marden calls, rather memorably, Have You the Alley Cat Consciousness? He shares a fable here about a scruffy, unloved alley cat who complains bitterly to her elegant Persian neighbor about why everyone treats the Persian so warmly, while everyone shuns the poor alley cat entirely. The Persian's answer is simple. I am puffed up, she says. I know I am some cat. You get treated as you do because everyone can plainly see that you think of yourself as nothing but a miserable, despised mongrel. Once the alley cat begins deliberately repeating to herself, I am a wonderful cat. Everybody loves me. Her circumstances, remarkably, begin to genuinely shift. Marden's point here is sharp and personal. So many of us, he says, carry around exactly this kind of alley cat consciousness, a deep, ingrained sense of our own inferiority, very often planted in us by careless parents or teachers in early childhood who casually told us we were dull or slow or would never amount to anything. And whatever picture of ourselves we carry inside, Marden insists, our own creative inner forces will quietly and faithfully build into our outward visible life. He is especially critical here of what he calls the can't afford it consciousness, describing a man of real talent and genuine ambition who nonetheless, at 60 years old, still looks and dresses like a struggling failure, simply because he never once broke free of the pinching, penny-counting habits of his impoverished student years. Watch your consciousness. Marden warns us directly, for out it will issue your entire destiny. From this question of self-image, Marden turns to a deeper and more searching question still. In the chapter he calls, How Do You Stand With Yourself? No man, Marden insists here, can truly be cheated out of an honorable life unless he first cheats himself. Even a person with millions of dollars, he says, is a genuine failure if they have quietly lost their own self-respect along the way in acquiring that fortune. He describes with real sympathy the inner torment of a man who is publicly admired and applauded, and yet who privately knows deep down that he is living a lie, that some small, persistent inner voice keeps quietly reminding him. All this praise is for a mask, not for the real you. Marden makes an important and interesting distinction here between the pleasure that comes from a night of reckless dissipation and the far deeper, steadier satisfaction that comes from a single day of genuinely honest, well-done work. The first kind of pleasure, he says, always leaves a bitter residue of shame behind it. The second kind builds something real and lasting inside a person. Character, he insists firmly, is never really a matter of money or outward position at all. It is a matter of whether you can look yourself honestly in the eye. Now, before we move into the more practical chapters of Marden's book, let's pause here together for just a moment. If this walk through his ideas about self-image, honest conscience, and inward power is giving you something worth carrying into your own day, consider subscribing to the channel, so these kind of reflections keep finding their way to you at the same steady pace. Now, let's continue on into how Marden applies all of this directly to the world of everyday work. In the chapter he calls a new philosophy in business, Marden opens with a wonderfully compact motto from a successful businessman he knew personally. Hold the thought and hustle. Hold the right mental attitude toward your work, Marden explains, and then work with everything you have to make that inward vision real in the outward world. He describes a businessman who has genuinely absorbed his philosophy as someone who simply refuses to take his worries home to bed with him at night, because he understands that a single hour of lost sleep, poisoned by fear, will cost him far more the next morning than it could ever possibly save him. Such a man locks his anxieties in his office drawer at the end of each day, Marden says, and greets his family at his own front door with nothing but genuine warmth and presence. Marden shares a memorable little exchange here between the great industrialist Andrew Carnegie and one of his superintendents, who proudly wired him one day to report that they had broken every previous output record. Carnegie's reply came back almost immediately. Why not do it every day? Marden holds this up as the very spirit of continuous, restless self-improvement that any thriving business, and indeed any thriving life, genuinely requires. He is especially firm here about the old excuse that business is business, a tired phrase, he says, that for far too long quietly justified all sorts of shady and outright dishonest dealing. The golden rule, Marden insists, has now firmly entered a world of business to stay. And any enterprise built instead on greed, deception, or the harsh exploitation of employees will, sooner or later, and quite inevitably, collapse under its own weight. Now, Marden takes us into one of the more genuinely fascinating chapters of the entire book, the one he titles, "What Are You Thinking into the Little Cell Minds of Your Body?" Drawing here on the cutting-edge biology of his own day, Marden argues that intelligence is never confined only to the brain, but is instead distributed throughout every single living cell in the entire body, each one working as a kind of tiny, conscious specialist, quietly laboring away for the good of the whole community. Every fear thought, he insists, every worry, every flash of hatred or jealousy sends its distinct message down into every one of these countless little cell communities and either strengthens or seriously weakens their actual physical functioning. He shares here a deeply moving personal account of visiting a friend hospitalized with a case of gangrene, so severe that the surgeons wanted to amputate his leg immediately at the knee. Surrounded by an atmosphere of pure despair, the patient's condition continued rapidly worsening until a Christian Science practitioner helped shift the whole surrounding mental atmosphere toward genuine hope and quiet expectancy instead. The patient's condition, Marden reports, turned around almost immediately, and the amputation, in the end, proved entirely unnecessary. Marden's clear and practical advice here is that we ought to treat our own bodily organs the very same way a wise and encouraging employer treats a group of genuinely willing workers. Just as you would never expect good work from an employee you constantly scolded and belittled, Marden says, you cannot expect strong, healthy performance from a stomach, a heart, or a set of nerves that you constantly curse and complain about in your own private thoughts. From this cellular chapter, Marden moves into what he calls facing life the right way. He tells us here Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes's memorable observation that what truly matters most in life is never really where you happen to stand, but rather simply which direction you happen to be facing. It is not our starting point in life, Marden insists, nor even how far along the road we've managed to travel, but the actual mental direction we are facing at any given moment that ultimately determines our whole destiny. He is especially firm here about what he calls a crime of low aim, quoting the memorable old phrase, not failure, but low aim is crime. Genuine failure, Marden insists, is not found in stumbling or even in falling down. It is found only in permanently turning your back on your own goal and surrendering the fight entirely. No man, he says, is ever truly beaten until his own hope inside him is completely annihilated. Now Marden turns to a genuinely useful and practical chapter he calls, Have You an Efficient Brain? Here he offers us a truly memorable and clever device, imagining an entire committee meeting of our various mental faculties, called together specifically to discuss why the whole mental team keeps producing such disappointing overall results. Self-confidence speaks up first, boasting rather proudly of his own steady, unwavering reliability. Timidity, by painful contrast, can barely manage to stand and speak at all, mumbling nervous apologies for her own paralyzing weakness. Courage argues passionately that the team desperately needs more daring and more boldness. Caution counters just as passionately that without her own steady restraining hand, the whole team would surely crash upon the rocks. Combativeness wants to stir up more conflict and more open confrontation. Amiability quietly but firmly insists that harmony, not conflict, is what actually builds anything worthwhile at all. Marden's clear point in walking us through this whole Imagine meeting is that none of these faculties, taken entirely on their own, is either simply good or simply bad. Courage without caution, he says, quickly becomes pure recklessness. Caution without courage just as quickly becomes pure, paralyzing timidity. The real secret of what Marden calls an efficient brain is simply this: learning to honestly locate your own particular imbalances and then patiently working day by day to bring your entire mental team back into proper working harmony. Now let's turn to a chapter Marden calls, quite vividly, camouflaging our troubles, borrowing the wartime term for the clever disguising of military equipment. Marden asks us here whether we have learned to do something quite similar with our own everyday troubles and hardships. He introduces us to two very different businessmen he happened to personally know, both facing roughly the very same difficult wartime conditions. One of them, whenever asked how business was going, would always answer with genuine warmth and cheer, finding something good to say even about the very worst weather. The other, asked that very same simple question, would immediately launch into a long, bitter litany of complaint, certain that absolutely everything, without exception, was going from bad to worse. Financially, Marden tells us these two men were roughly equal, but when it came to genuine happiness, one of them was, in Marden's memorable phrase, an outright bankrupt, while the other was, in every real sense that actually mattered, a true millionaire. He shares here the touching story of Ralph Waldo Emerson's home library burning entirely to the ground, and how Emerson, watching his priceless and irreplaceable books go up in flame, remained remarkably calm and composed throughout, even managing to say to his worried friend, Louisa May Alcott, "Never mind. Louisa, see what a beautiful blaze it makes. We'll enjoy that now." Thomas Edison, too, when his massive laboratory complex burned down in his later years, simply told the assembled newspaper reporters, "I'm pretty well burned out just now, boys, but I'll start all over tomorrow," and then remarkably quoted Kipling's famous poem aloud to them on the spot. The real secret to what Marden calls equanimity, this deep, settled evenness of temper amid even the very worst circumstances, is not, he insists, some rare natural gift given only to a fortunate few. It is a deliberate habit, patiently cultivated day by day, of consciously choosing, again and again, to rise above whatever small or large annoyance happens to be right in front of us at any given moment. Now Marden takes up a chapter of real and immediate encouragement, the one he calls Winning Out in Middle Life. He opens here with a story of a capable, experienced, 50-year-old woman who simply could not manage to find steady employment. Not, Marden insists, because of her actual age at all, but because of what he pointedly calls her age-thought, the quiet, defeated, discouraged manner she now unknowingly carried into every single interview. Marden pushes back forcefully here against what was, in his own era, a fashionable and widely repeated idea that a person's most useful and productive years supposedly end somewhere around the age of 40. He points instead to numerous vigorous, thriving older men still doing brilliant, energetic work well into their 70s and even their 80s, Thomas Edison prominent among them, a man who claimed he could still run up a flight of stairs 2 steps at a time well into his later years. Age, Marden insists here quite firmly, is fundamentally a state of mind rather than an actual accumulation of birthdays. If you carry yourself with genuine energy, real enthusiasm, and a clean, well-groomed appearance, and if you approach any employer with the honest and quiet confidence that you still have real value to genuinely offer, your actual years, he insists, will matter far, far less than you might otherwise fear. Now Marden turns to a chapter on how to realize your ambition. He compares an ambition that is never actually acted upon to the sad windfall of fruit littering an orchard floor in early autumn, fruit that fell prematurely, long before it was ever truly ripe, simply because it lost its living grip on the nourishing sap still flowing steadily through the tree above it. So many people, Marden warns us, allow their own once bright and vivid ambitions to quietly fade in exactly the same slow, gradual way, worn down bit by bit through nothing more dramatic than simple, ordinary procrastination. He shares a genuinely sad story of a talented young man with a real passion for law and for public service, who kept endlessly postponing, year after year, his actual preparation for bar, always fully intending to begin next year instead, until he finally woke up one day to discover he was nearly 40 years old, and his once vivid, once burning ambition had simply and quietly died. The clear remedy Marden offers here is refreshingly direct. Begin now, this very day, rather than waiting for some more perfectly convenient future moment that will, in all honesty, most likely never actually arrive. From ambition, Marden turns next to a chapter he calls A Web of Fate, which is really at its heart a chapter about the true, quiet power of habit. He shares here the vivid, memorable image of a clergyman who once bound a small boy in his pulpit, first with a single strand of light cotton thread, then progressively with twine, then cord, then rope, and finally with a genuine iron chain and padlock, to demonstrate, quite dramatically, exactly how a habit truly forms, one small and seemingly harmless repetition steadily building upon another, until what began as a most delicate and easily broken thread has slowly and silently become an unbreakable iron chain. What people casually call fate or destiny, Marden insists here, is really nothing more than a web of their very own quiet weaving, spun entirely from the accumulated threads of their own repeated thoughts and habitual actions. The remedy for any deeply entrenched bad habit, he tells us, is never a slow, gradual, half-hearted tapering off. It is instead a single, clean, decisive break, backed immediately afterward by the strongest and most vivid possible mental picture of the new and better habit you genuinely intend to firmly establish in its place. Now Marden turns to a chapter he calls The Open Door, built entirely around one single, central promise. Behold, I have set before you an open door which no man can shut. He argues here that genuine poverty is never truly caused by any actual scarcity in the world itself, since the earth, he insists, remains packed everywhere with far more real abundance than humanity has even begun to properly discover or develop. Poverty, Marden insists instead, is caused chiefly by our own deep ignorance, by our habitual selfishness toward one another, and, quite significantly, by our own persistent and corrosive lack of genuine faith. He shares a touching, quietly encouraging story of a woman raised comfortably in real luxury, who, after her husband's sudden illness and financial ruin, transformed her own once dreaded kitchen drudgery into a genuine and fascinating scientific study of nutrition and diet, ultimately finding it both a welcome new source of real income and, quite unexpectedly, a deep and lasting personal satisfaction she had genuinely never known before. The open door of real opportunity, Marden insists firmly, stands wide open before every single human being alive, and no circumstance, no misfortune, no accident of birth can ever truly close it against us. Only our own persistent fear and our own stubborn unbelief, he says, can ever manage to shut that door. And now, finally, Marden closes his book with a chapter he calls, quite memorably, Do You Carry Victory in Your Face? No man, he insists here, can ever really expect to become a genuine conqueror in life while he still openly carries, in his own face and in his own bearing, the unmistakable, visible marks of defeat. He shares here the vivid, telling story of two young men let go from the very same company on the very same unfortunate day. One of them arrived at Marden's office looking utterly defeated, his shoulders visibly slumped, his clothing carelessly rumpled, convinced entirely that he had simply been born under some unlucky star. The other young man, facing the exact same setback, arrived instead looking well-groomed, genuinely confident, and quietly certain that a far better position was already just around the corner, waiting patiently for him. Years later, Marden tells us, this second young man was running a thriving business of his own, a business considerably larger, in fact, than the very one that had once let him go. We are all, Marden reminds us in these closing pages, constantly sized up, judged, and quietly measured by the simple impression we make on the people around us and other people's honest estimate of us, whether we fully realize it or not. Genuinely does shape a real and significant part of our overall success in life. If you want to build success into your own life, Marden's closing advice runs, you must first stop talking failure, stop talking poverty, stop visibly carrying defeat around in your own face and in your own posture, and instead learn to talk success, to think success, and to walk through the world exactly like the person you genuinely intend from this very day forward to actually become. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of Orison Swett Marden's You Can, But Will You? We've walked together through the magic mirror that reveals our own truer and larger self, through a whole new and warmer idea of the divine, through the mighty and often overlooked force of simple self-confidence, through the quiet but very real consequences of our own everyday self-image, through honest questions of conscience and self-respect, through the practical, hard-headed philosophy of hold of thought and hustle, through the surprising intelligence quietly at work in every single cell of our own bodies, through the true and lasting secret of genuine equanimity, through vivid proof that middle age and beyond need never mean any real decline at all, through the patient, daily work of keeping an ambition genuinely alive, through the silent, accumulating power of ordinary habit, to the open door of abundance that stands waiting for every one of us, and finally, into the simple, visible, outward bearing of someone who has truly learned to carry quiet victory in their own face. If there's one single thread running through everything Marden has shared with us today, it is simply this: the raw ability was very likely there in you all along. The only real and honest question, now that you know it, is the very same one printed right there on the cover of this book. You can, but will you? Thank you so much for spending this time with me and with Orison Swett Marden. If these ideas gave you something genuinely worth carrying forward into your own life, please consider subscribing to the channel so these kind of journeys keep finding their way to you. Until next time, carry a little more victory in your own face today, and I will see you in the next one.